Hello friends, welcome to the Senior Rehab Project. I'm Meg Lowry. As part of the Down Under series, I'm hosting this episode interviewing Jacki Liddle, occupational therapist at the University of Queensland, who I had the pleasure of seeing present at a recent conference on improving the health of older people. And Jacki was doing some pretty intriguing research into older people with dementia or people living with dementia and their technology needs, and also into an outcome measure that she's developing called Life Space. And I really want to dig deeper into that. So I've invited Jacki along to tell us a little bit more about it. Jacki, welcome.
Thanks, Meg.
Jacki, before we get going, how about you just give our listeners a little bit of a background about your career to date and how you came to be an academic at UQ studying this interesting topic?
Sure. So it's a little bit winding, as I think a lot of people's careers are. So when I graduated OT, I was very keen to work with older people, and I worked in community aged care. I also have worked in mental health and vision rehabilitation. But what I started to encounter was a clinical problem that I couldn't find a solution for. I went and looked at papers, and I went back to uni and I said, look, my clients are having trouble managing stopping driving. They're really sad and isolated and struggling with it even years later. There's not a question that they should be driving. It's not an iffy kind of driving assessment result. It's actually that they need more support. And someone should do something about this. And I was promptly told that someone should be me. So that became my PhD topic. So I started to investigate what was the experiences for older people related to stopping driving, what kind of happened with their mental health needs, with the way they use their time, with the places they go, and what kind of help would they need to plan for it and adjust to it. So that was my foray into research, and I've kind of stayed in research, doing clinical research since. So we developed an intervention based on that research, which is called Car Free Me, and helps people with their adjustment to driving cessation. But then I've also been fortunate enough to kind of look into a number of other areas. So, for example, one of my postdoc positions was looking at deep brain stimulation for people with Parkinson's disease and how the psychosocial adjustment to that could be supported. And currently I'm working on a project where we're co-developing technology with people living with dementia to support their communication and their quality of life. So I'm lucky in that I get to always learn new things, which is great.
Great for brain health too.
Yeah.
So you've got your finger in quite a few different pies, and they're all, I think what really strikes me about your work is that you're really choosing things that are meaningful to the person, and you're trying to come up with solutions to better support the person on their journey through the late stage of life, or through a condition, to try to optimize their enjoyment of life. And I think that really came through in your presentation. It was a while ago that I saw you speak, Jacki, but the thing that I think really intrigued me the most, I think the thing that we might start with today, is Life Space. Can you tell us what is it can you define Life Space to us as you have researched it?
Yeah, so Life Space is not a new concept. It sounds new, and every time I talk to people about it, they think it's new, but it came about in gerontology research in the 1970s, if you can believe it. Mm-hmm. And it's the geographic space in which we live and in which we conduct our activities. So it's the places you go and where you do things. Where it started was in residential care facilities. So it was an observational kind of metric where people would say, who's coming out to the dining room, who kind of goes out into the grounds, and, you know, who's just staying in their room, because they thought it was important for both well-being, understanding someone's physical health, and also looking at the quality of care. But it soon became obvious that it maybe is even more important to consider in the community, that just because someone's living in the community doesn't mean they are able to access all the things they need in the community. So another way of thinking about life space is that it's somebody's lived mobility. It's the places that they're actually going during a period of time, or the distances they're actually travelling during a period of time. And it used to be measured then through an interview or a survey, where you'd say, well, how many times a week are you going into your neighbourhood? Do you need any help for that? How many times a week are you going beyond that? And they would create a score based on somebody's distances, basically, they were travelling. But since that time, because that's quite hard to remember sometimes, and people might be giving us the answers they think we want to hear. There's always that issue with self-report. It could be a little bit shaped. You know, how people tell you they've definitely been doing every exercise that's recommended. It could be that people are saying, oh, yes, I'm getting out every day.
Absolutely. And it's often not quite an accurate reflection of what's actually happening. Sometimes it's not.
Sometimes it's not. And sometimes it's even shaped not in the way that you're expecting either, that they might be telling you that they're not going places because they're worried they might not get the services that they need or something like that. But it was more about a lot of the people who would be interested in their life space might have some difficulties with memory, or might not really need an extra thing to do in their day, you know, filling in a little diary of where they went. And smartphones coming about with their GPS meant that we're able to passively collect the location of the phone. So if somebody's carrying the phone, we can collect their locations for a period of time, and we generally use a week. So they get loaned a phone with an app that was developed with Cyro, and we are able to measure their life space data.
Sure, and we'll just let our listeners know that CSIRO is like a peak scientific body for research in Australia. So is this app that you're using to measure life space, is it available for download now, or is it really only used for research? Like, can the everyday clinician use it now?
No.
No, okay.
No, at the moment, because it involves a portal that's kind of set up and secure to a project, is probably a little bit expensive to use just on its own. But we have looked at a number of different ways, and we're still looking at other ways of measuring it as well. Because I think if the concept is important to people, then it's something we can find accessible ways of using it in clinical practice. We're not quite sure yet what's a useful amount of data, because it comes through a lot of passively collected data. It's very detailed, and perhaps clinicians don't want that level of detail. So we're still in the process of figuring out what is it that people want to know, what's helpful to people who are measuring their own life space, what's helpful to clinical teams who are supporting them. And there are different ways that you could measure that. People also can do maybe something that's somewhere between the old school survey and the app, which is to print out a Google Maps and mark on it the places that you've gone in the past week, and you can calculate using Google Maps what that area is. So that's probably easier for people to remember than being told things like, well, neighbourhood and things like that. Often people are able to say, oh, this is where my grocery shop is, and so forth.
Sure. I think the thing that I found like so insightful was a pictorial representation, like a graph. It kind of almost looked like a Venn diagram, if you will, that you had in your PowerPoint presentation, where it was showing where a participant, so a person with a particular disease, it might have been Parkinson's disease, where they move, how far they travel from home, and it was sort of shaded in, let's say, green, for example, how far they travel from home in this week, and that the shape of that travel sort of represented their life space. So it was more information than just frequency of leaving the house, but how far they travel. And then what was really interesting was you also mapped the carer and how far they travelled from home. and you'd be able to, and they sort of look like an overlapping Venn diagram, because you could see when the person travelled from home with their carer and without their carer, or maybe not when at a time point, but where they travelled differently, and how it basically gave a representation of how much the carer gets to do on their own, and how much the client can do on their own, and how much they have to do together. And pre and post intervention, that kind of data can give us more meaningful insight into whether or not an intervention to improve somebody's mobility has worked, because it might be that the person doesn't even leave the house any more frequently. Say I've got a client and he's had a stroke or he has Parkinson's disease, and I've worked on his balance and his mobility, and maybe he's not leaving the house any more frequently now than he did prior to the intervention. But if the carer is confident that he is safe to mobilise in his home alone, and the carer doesn't need to be there to help with transfers or to supervise when he goes to the toilet, the carer is confident that he's safe to leave home alone, the carer then gets to move a further distance from home, can leave the house for more than 10 minutes at a time, can travel further. And when I saw that picture, I went, wow, that information would be a game changer to me if only I had sort of access to that one day.
Yeah, it's something that kind of, it's data that when you visualise it, when you kind of create a way of summarising what's been going on in a household, it starts a conversation as well. So it's a tricky one, because as you say, it can be that situation where spending more time apart could be absolutely the goal of the therapy. It could be something else again. So we need that insight from people as well. But what a good place to start in the conversation. What is your goal? Is your goal to go further, or is your goal to go independently? We also find a lot of family members, when they're doing things like providing just transport support, they don't even necessarily relate to the term caregiver, that they don't count themselves as a carer. They're just a spouse or a daughter or a friend who's driving someone places, and that's what friends do. But it actually is taking up a lot of their time and effort, and it's not always captured. I was involved, we had a PhD student who looked at the impact of people not returning to driving after a brain injury, and she found some really interesting things about the impact on family, and how it might be 10 years later and the family is still driving someone everywhere, and in fact spending a lot of time doing things like waiting in car parks. So the person might be participating in a lot of different things, but the family member, through that role of providing support, might not be. So it was something that was really useful for us to have a look at too, in a couple of different contexts. Huge.
I think the value of that information is huge, and you're right. It is more as a conversation starter than as a, it's not a definitive measure in its own right unless you know exactly what matters to that person. Yeah. But I don't think when a client and their carer sort of talk to me about their weekly routine, I don't think that it really stands out to me how much the carer is getting to do on their own. Like, can they even get out to have a haircut on their own, or how much the client can do on their own. I think that matters for both of them. And you're right, they don't necessarily see themselves as a carer, but these are questions that we don't always have the time to ask, and we don't want to pry, and we don't necessarily know that it's relevant to a condition that we're treating in front of us. But if there were a means of capturing that, and if there was a mandate for it or a reason for it, I think that would just be it would shine a lot of light on a situation that could help us to explore how to better support people.
Absolutely. And we found, in looking in a research context of getting people to measure it, it did start them reflecting on, is this what I really want? Or, would it be better for us? I think a lot of spouses don't want to spend all their time together, for example, even if they're getting on really well. It's the kind of situation where most people want some time and some places that they go where it's just them.
Of course.
So it's something that's important to consider, not just more places, but meaningful places, and, what roles you get to take when you're at those places as well.
Yeah. funny because, you know, I think Alyssa did an episode a while back on frequency of leaving the house and mortality
Yes.
for people. And between the ages of 70 and 95, it was a Jeremy Jacobs study. I think it was published this year. And I'm just trying to look it up now. The conclusion was that in community dwelling older adults aged 70 to 90, leaving the house daily was associated with lower mortality risk, independent of social function or medical status. So they even had controlled for this social, functional and medical status and found that just the number of times they left the house was associated with lower mortality risk. I wonder if we have more detail about not just leaving the house, but how far they travel. I know it's as the crow flies, but you can certainly capture more information with something like LifeSpace. I wonder if we'll be able to find that those kind of measures are more sensitive to identifying changes in a person's lifestyle or a person's home situation that might even flag a future functional decline or a decline in health or a decline in happiness, you know, and in their relationships. I wonder if that kind of a measure in the future might play a role. Like, do you think, I mean, let's start talking before we even talk about the practicalities of using this as a measure outside of research, because I know that it's super important in research, but I can just think about situations, but like for somebody on a home care package, for example, where it would be lovely information to capture at the beginning of a home care package and then to review it in a year's time and see if the home care package has actually improved their life space, and if not, why not, and that sort of thing. And perhaps if it was reviewed annually, we might be able to tell when the person's starting to reduce their life space. And if we know that that has any consequences or associations with their long-term health, we might be able to sort of form an earlier intervention with them to improve it. But let's talk about the ethics of it.
Yeah.
What ethical considerations did you need, even just getting this sort of a study through ethics committee?
Yeah, so it's something that we always have to think about when we measure anything. So when you ask people just in surveys, you have to think about, okay, is this something that's going to be difficult for someone? Is there going to be emotional consequences? Or if I'm getting someone to have scans or so forth. When we're collecting data passively and we're not sure whether people really understand what's happening, it's pretty important that we find a way of explaining it in a meaningful way and find a way that people can opt out. So that was part of our thinking with lending people a phone rather than saying, well, if you have a phone, let's put the app on your own phone. So the idea is if you don't want certain locations to have data collected, if you don't want people to know where you are on Wednesdays, that's your right as a research participant and also as a patient if you were going to use it clinically. You get to say what's not known about you. And because the data, the raw data that's collected is longitude and latitude, it's the physical location where you are, and you can plug that into Google Maps and see where somebody was at a particular time in the raw data. They have to be told that and they have to give consent to this being collected. So when we report it, we never report the raw data and we would not ever share data sets because they can't be de-identified properly. And as the app, when the app moves to the, hopefully in the future, a version that could be released clinically, we may even have it so that it never does send the raw data, that the raw data never leaves the phone, and that instead it records a distance from a specified location, the home location, to another location. So rather than collecting the raw data, we've moved towards being able to collect something where people's actual locations can stay anonymous. The reasons we haven't done that is because we need to troubleshoot with technology that's new. We need to be able to say to people, is this a good record of where you were? And if we don't have locations, that's quite hard for people to tell us if they're just looking at a graph, for example.
Yeah, fair enough. And did you leave your phone behind that day or?
Yeah. And did you forget to charge it? We had some people who were very worried about losing it so they didn't take it to some places where they thought it might get lost or stolen. So, that's not so good for data, but it is really important as researchers that we are ethical in our practice. The other thing I would say is that people are often sharing their geolocation data and not thinking about it, partly because it's kind of invisible that it's happening. So a lot of our phones are often sharing our location, with providers. And when we say yes to using something like Twitter or Facebook, we're often saying yes to sharing our location. And certainly a lot of the wearables, like Fitbit and so forth, share the location, as we saw with that news story where people on a secret military base, their patrolling was able to be picked up on a data sharing site because people were sharing their geolocation with a kind of social look at how I'm exercising app.
Fail.
Yes, absolutely. And so now the armed forces have a policy about Fitbits and so forth, but it is something where we just don't think about it. We share a lot and don't think about it. I think people have the right to say, look, I want to share my location, and that's fine with me. But they also have the right to be told what exactly is happening and what that means before they make those decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are, like you said, there are ways around it as well. Like I like how you've sort of changed the data to have, I think, more meaning to the reader anyway. But rather than just talking about kilometres from home, you've got like life space 0 is in their bedroom and life space 1 is in their home. Life space 2 is outside the house. Life space 3 is the neighbourhood. Life space 4 is the town, and life space 5 is unlimited. So it's a way of kind of classifying those distances in a way that also makes sense for us.
Yeah, so that was from the original traditional way it's been measured. That's those survey kind of items. So if a clinician was interested now in getting a bit of a broad idea of how someone's going, they could use that questionnaire, or they could ask about those questions to kind of get a bit of a sense. But yes, we also can then crunch our data backwards to create that kind of insight as well.
Yeah, which might be useful when you're trying to interpret your data anyway.
It is, but it is also something where I'm just trying to remember which country the original survey was created, but certainly they had an estimated distance associated with it. And you can imagine lots of people living in Queensland, particularly outside of Brisbane, would have really big big distances to get to their neighbourhood. So it's more about what that means for them. Yeah,
that makes sense. Tell me, you've looked at life space specifically in people with Parkinson's disease or people living with neurological conditions. Was there any particular study that comes to mind that, where the outcome measure was useful in understanding what was happening with that population?
Yeah, so we've just conducted little studies, both trying to figure out whether it was feasible, whether it was a reasonable thing to ask people to do, to carry a phone and charge it and share this kind of data, and also to help us understand what kind of issues we're starting to see, what are meaningful metrics for us to calculate for research understanding and for clinicians. So we did a couple. 2 of them we collected the data ourselves, and one of them had data that was shared through the Michael J. Fox Foundation. So all of them did allow us to see things like the fact that, say for people living with Parkinson's, and with other groups that we've seen as well, people tend to have quite a lot of variability. So they do often have a busy day and a quiet day, and then the following day might be a busy day, that we need rest days. And this is something that once we saw that, we could talk to people and say, tell us about that, and it's important for a couple of reasons. If you're running a community service that's going to support people leaving the home, you do have to think about the need for someone to perhaps have a rest day. If they've had a day where they've travelled a lot and done a lot of things, they might need a day where they're not travelling a lot the next day. It also tells us some things for research in that if you just collect one day You know, if you just looked at how someone was going on one day, you wouldn't get at all an accurate idea of how things are going for them. So it's something that we need to consider as well. And it was something that when people looked at their own data, which they were able to do in the studies, they started to reflect on things like, you know, how energy conservation might be useful to them. So some people would have a number of busy days in a row and then a big series of quiet days where they just kind of, not literally, but fallen in a heap, that they'd overdone it, that they had, you know, a lot of fatigue and pain and were not up for doing other things. So it was about maybe learning what's a good amount to do, what's a good way of managing your symptoms and so forth. So yeah, it's an interesting thing for sure. We also were able to look at, just in a very small study, the impact of particular interventions. And some of these aren't interventions that aim particularly at life space, but we looked at deep brain stimulation, for example, and how that changed, how having deep brain stimulation led to different community access or different distances travelled afterwards. And what was nice about that study was that we were able to post the phones to people. So they were able to collect this data, kind of living in their own communities, which often were not in Brisbane. And we got some insights into, you know, how difficult that adjustment process could be for people who weren't living close to a clinic who was managing them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's super interesting. I think with the deep brain stimulation, I mean, it's going to tell us so much. Like I might see a client with Parkinson's disease and they have deep brain stimulation, and I do a number of tests to see how it changes their function, but it doesn't necessarily, or how far they can walk. But something like LifeSpace will tell me how far they do go, and it's not just walking. So it's not a measure of how far they do walk. It's what ability you actually have sort of determines how confident you feel in participating in your community. So the fact that they can walk further only really matters if they actually are going to use it to participate in life in a different way. And so to see that that sort of graphical representation of what that means to them, I think that is quite profound.
Yeah, and I think it also could highlight people who are needing a little bit more support, particularly for their confidence. So a lot of people might report symptom improvement, but not necessarily any more participation. And sometimes we'd have family members who are quite frustrated because they're saying, you know, they should be doing more. But there was actually more things going on for that person in terms of adjustment, and people need support for that. So it might be a really useful marker to say, you know, do we need to consider something here? And the other part that I really like about LifeSpace is that it gives us insights into someone's physical abilities. It gives us insights into their mental health and their well-being, because those interact, you know, really strongly. Things like apathy and motivation and so forth, and their cognitive ability to plan and sequence and so forth. But it also gives us insights into the supports that are available to them and how accessible their communities are. So somebody who lives with a very steep hill or a very steep driveway even might not be leaving the home. And that might be not related at all to their ability to walk, but to their ability to manage this driveway, or to their fear perhaps of having fallen on it before. So it opens up something that's quite a large conversation that maybe lots of different health professionals could get involved with, in terms of how to improve our communities and make them more livable as well.
Oh, absolutely. I can think of a client of mine in the past who she could just walk laps and laps of her apartment complex, and that's what we had to do with her, because she had steep hills around her home and she had a low ejection fraction, and her doctor had said to her, with your heart the way it is, I don't want you to walk hills.
Oh, goodness.
And I, no matter how hard I tried, I sort of really couldn't get the details of who that cardiologist was and get on, you know, he hadn't reviewed her in 3 years or something, so it sort of wasn't really appropriate for me to have that discussion with him. But what it had done is it had absolutely limited her life space. But she was getting around it by catching a bus to the city, which is all flat, Brisbane City, and
Yes.
she used to walk around Brisbane City. And then she had a fall, one fall after walking like 600 metres or something. She usually used to stop every few hundred metres and have a rest, but she couldn't for some reason that day, and she walked further and she ended up falling, which she just thought she tripped over her own feet.
Oh,
and then
dear.
her children had said, her daughters had said, "Mum, we don't want you walking around the city anymore." And I don't think that, and they said, "Oh, you shouldn't be out there on your own in the city anyway. You shouldn't be catching buses to the city, so we'll take you." And I really tried to explain to her daughters, who weren't often available to have this conversation with as well, it's often over the phone, you know, what that would do to her long term, to her health and her well-being. And I wish that there was some kind of metric that I could sort of show just how much that's going to close her world in, you know.
That the life space, so how it's been measured traditionally through the surveys even, has shown across a number of massive studies, so different populations, different places, that those kind of outcomes you talked about before in terms of actually dying sooner, ending up in residential care. For people who already have dementia, they get more rapid decline, even when we're controlling for other things. So it's something that really we don't know cause and effect, but it seems to be something that's definitely an indicator for having a closer look and seeing if we can help people recover their life space or support their continued life space as much as we can. And it's a tricky one for families for sure, because that idea of risk, we're very, very risk averse as a society, and we particularly seem to have, an attitude for older people where we're even more so. And it's something that there is dignity to being able to take risks. I could go for a walk in the city and trip over my own feet for sure. It's something where we do have to be very careful that we don't overreact to someone, having an incident and kind of clamp down all their options. We've seen that in other studies too, where family members might say, "Not happy with you crossing the road outside your house, it's a busy road, so wait for me to take you anywhere." And you can see the impact that this has on somebody. They have a lot of time to spend where they're not doing things and where they're maybe worrying or where they're, experiencing that feeling of loss for what they're not able to do anymore.
I'm going to read a quote, Jacki, that was on one of your slides. I've just pulled it up, and I remember reflecting on it at the time. It was a man called Paul. He was 88 years old, living with mild cognitive impairment, living alone, and he actually spends 95% of his time at home. So this is him. This is a quote. I'm not going to put on Paul's accent, because you should all know that I'm terrible at doing accents, because I try to do Dustin Jones's accents, and I'm just like, I'm going to be respectful of your time. And I just right. So I'm not going to be an 88-year-old man, but I just want to read to you what that 5% of the time that he spends out of home, what that actually means to him. So there is certainly quality as well. There's a quality, not quantity kind of debate to be had there. But just have a think about this. Every morning I go for a walk, just for a 2-kilometre walk. I just say hello to everybody I pass on the morning. I come back past and there's a little park there with mothers and babies and fathers. That's lovely to watch them. Then the Historical Society have a historic house along the way. I always walk past and have a look in there just to make sure it hasn't been taken over with backpackers or something. I just have a look. It doesn't hurt. I go past. I don't belong to it. I don't have to do it, There's a crowd up the way. They look after the animals and they always want newspapers. So I keep newspapers for them and I deliver them. I've got a packet there to deliver to them on the way past. And I come back to the chemist and I have pills made up weekly on a sheet. So I do that. And I say hello to the lady across the way who runs the laundry every day. She's by herself, and that's it. And when I read that, I thought he spends 95% of his time at home, but that 5% of his time in a 2-kilometre walk that he does every day, he sees so many faces.
Yes.
And I think for all of us, seeing a human face, to read a human face is more complex than reading a book. We do it all the time, so we don't think about it, but our brain is working in the background, reading and interpreting what does that facial expression mean, and what does that tone of voice mean when you say hello to that lady? Is she happy? Is she happy to see me? Is she not? Is she grumpy? You know, the brain is working endlessly when we are interacting with human beings, and his brain would get so much stimulation just from that 5% of the time. When you add it up over a 24-hour period, it's not a lot of time, but that 5% of the time that he spends out of his home in a week or in a day, I think we have to really find ways that we can emphasize that, the importance of that, to our clients and to their families and to care providers who facilitate these sorts of things, and to government bodies who fund social participation, services. And Life Spaces is one way I think that we can help to do that. So I commend you for your work and your contribution to the literature. I know that you didn't develop it yourself, but what you're doing with it, and where you're taking it, and especially in the way that you're using it with populations of people who have cognitive impairment and populations of people who are losing their driver's license. I think the information that you're sort of collating for us is going to help us to be a more responsive and supportive community for older adults.
Thank you. I mean, I love that quote too, in that it also shows connection and it shows responsibility. You know, all these different things that have been a lifelong part for Paul, that he's been a responsible person, that he's had all these roles in the community. If he was only able to get that 2 kilometres by going around and round his backyard or his apartment, it wouldn't be the same experience. So I think we have to consider how to make our communities friendly and accessible for as many people as we can, so that he not only gets something out of doing that, but look at all the things that the community gets out of him being there as he goes for his 2 kilometre walk.
Absolutely. Jacki, why don't you tell us just a tad about the Car Free Me intervention? So you said you looked at the impact of loss of driver's license on the well-being of older adults and a number of other metrics. And then you developed an intervention. What intervention have you developed, and where do you think we should go with that? I mean, I'm sure that you haven't sort of nutted out you can't hang your hat on it and say this is the absolute right way forwards at this point, because you're still sort of playing around with it. But what does your intervention entail? What's your best bet at the moment?
Yeah, so with driving cessation, it's something that also pops up in those big population longitudinal studies. It's that people, when they stop driving, and we control for health and frailty and kind of independence measures, they're an at-risk group. They're at risk to get depression. They're at risk to need to go to residential care, and they're at risk to get sick with more things following. So they're a group that needs some support. We also know that people just don't want to talk about it and don't want to think about it. And people we've interviewed have said it's the hardest thing they've ever dealt with. And it is something, you know, coming from people who've dealt with a lot in their lives. So it's a tough one. Our intervention, we asked people what they thought they wanted. So it has 2 parts, and it does have a website. So it's www.carfreeme.com.au if you want a bit more information, with all the papers linked there. But it's got an awareness raising part. So this is for when people are not ready to really consider it. That, you know, it's just to put it on their agenda, to firstly tell them what they want to hear about, which is about how to keep driving safely, so flag some of those issues, and then just give some advice direct from older drivers who've stopped successfully about what they think is a good thing to do, you know, how to plan for stopping driving, what were good things for them to consider. So that's just a brief, presentation with some local content related to what services are available locally. It's generally done as a talk, but can be a brochure. And then the main intervention for when people stop or when they have a need to stop within a period of time. So if the doctor said, I won't be renewing your licence, it's an intensive group program. It can be done individually, but when we've tested it, we've mainly tested it in groups. And people come along to a community venue and they learn about all kinds of things related to getting older. They learn about the experiences of others in giving up driving. We cover loss and change and practical ways of coping with change, including problem solving, cognitive behavioural techniques, and some really practical things about buses and trains and so forth in their local areas. So we have outings. We all head off on the buses and the ferries and whatever's local. A key part, though, is that people set their own goals. So they say, what is it that I want to achieve? What is it I'm worried about? Where are the places that I want to go that I'm worried I won't be able to go? And then the group is shaped according to who's attending and what their goals are. So it's quite individualised. And for older people, we've run a randomised clinical trial where we showed that it did significantly increase the number of times people leave home during the week, and it increased their use of alternative transport and their feelings of confidence about accessing or continuing their life without driving, so being able to do the things that they wanted to do. Thank you. We're just doing an equivalent trial with 2 arms or 2 parts to it that's being led by Teresa Scott, and we're looking at an adapted program that are for people living with dementia and giving up driving. So we're looking at both a telehealth model of delivery and a face-to-face model of delivery. And we did run a small trial as well down in South Australia looking at this for people after a traumatic injury, so a younger group of people, and how they cope with kind of interruption to driving and cessation of driving. So lots happening in that area as well.
I think that you're really working on the things that are meaningful, and I commend you for that. I've said it before, and I'll forever be championing the work that you're doing, because I think it's great. And then finally, because I know I want to be respectful of your time. I hope Dustin knows I'm not teasing him there. I just can't say it. So I just want to find out just a little bit about your focus groups that you've been hosting for people with dementia, and I think it also involves their caregivers, and what it is that they want out of technology. Tell me about that approach, and then any key findings that you've got to date.
Okay. Yeah. So this project that I'm engaged in at the moment is called the Florence Project. And its aim is to work with people living with dementia and their care partners, so often family members and friends, to develop technology together. And that's a really cool process where we're all learning a lot. So parts of it, so we have a lived experience expert reference group where people who are living with dementia and their care partners advise the study, where we check in with them when we're planning things. Right at the beginning, we checked in with them and said, okay, what should our focus be? What do you think about these ideas? Do you have any concerns about using this approach? And then we're moving on through a number of different things where we've asked people about, because it's got a focus on communication. So what is the experience like of living with the communication changes related to dementia? And then we're asking them about, well, what have your technology experiences been? What do you feel about technology? What's working well and what's not working well? And then we're working with people. We're just starting in the new year a study where we're going to design personalised technology for people. So we're going to go with them and say, if anything was possible and if we can do it, so we have a multidisciplinary team that has health people and technology people and lived experience experts, we're going to make something for each person to kind of say, okay, and it will help us understand how to build technology better for this group, because the mainstream technology that we have is not hitting the mark. We see lots of problems, lots of people who have been gifted iPads or tablets and they're sitting in a drawer because they don't make sense to them. They have so much potential, but they're not accessible. And it might even be something as simple as having a really obvious pressable button, or not needing to swipe or enter a password or something like that. So we're just working through this process at the moment. And over summer, we've actually got a whole bunch of technology students who we're also seeing how to teach the technology developers of the future about this group. So we have our lived experience experts involved in the teaching as well.
I really like that term, lived experience experts. What a way to empower people and to give them, place enough value on them and show them that you value their input in the process. Thank you so much for your time, and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Senior Rehab Project. If you gained from this episode, consider supporting our work. You can become a patron through Patreon, a service that allows people like you to support people like us. You can give as little as $1 a month or become a game changer for $8.99 a month, where you get this awesome redefined old mug and access to our monthly meetups. They're really a blast. Just go to theseniorrehabproject.com to learn more and find the show notes for this episode. Talk to you soon, and don't forget to stay funky.